But I guess let's talk a bit more about Florida because that's your first chapter,
Yes,
right?
it's also where I'm from.
Oh, there
Yes.
you go. Whereabouts?
Tampa, about an hour north of Tampa.
Tampa. There you go. So uh, the you start in Florida, telling the story of a guy named Patrick Garvey. What this was I guess one of the three chapters in the start of your book where you're focusing on these human stories behind the weather disasters. What's Patrick Garvey's story?
Yeah, he came from Canada down to Florida, sort of just like looking for meaning, and he spent about 5 years rehabilitating this tropical fruit grove that had kind of gone to seed. It was the property of this old hermit, and it became like this public sort of community resource on this island called Big Pine Key, which is like one of the last kind of like working class enclaves in the Florida Keys archipelago. And then this hurricane called Irma, just an astonishingly powerful hurricane. Just all but he had basically spent almost a decade restoring this grove, and right as he finished, basically the hurricane destroyed it. Also, kind of destroyed his life. His marriage fell apart. His kids went with their mother to Brazil, and he basically spent like 5 years, kind of in like a dark night of the soul, trying to restore this grove, only to kind of find that long term there's this other vulnerability that the island faces from sea level rise. So as the seas get higher, even independent of a storm, water will creep underneath, salt water will creep underneath the island, potentially making it very difficult to grow tropical fruit. But so I was kind of using it to show that there's like these two scales of vulnerability that people face in climate change. And the Keys is like a great example where on the one hand, you have these giant kind of percussive disasters that completely destroy housing stock and render people without their homes. And then you have these slower moving disasters like sea level rise or drought, where people's sort of their ability to engage with the land and their ability to work, their ability to live sort of erodes over time. And the worst affected places are dealing with both of those at the same time. And in the case of the Keys, like the risk is really existential from both, that you might not really be able to, the place might not really be able to survive on a century long time scale because there's just so much risk.
That's insane to think about. But I mean, obviously it makes total sense. Another place that you highlight that has is in a very vulnerable position is this indigenous community in Louisiana. Obviously Louisiana vulnerable in a variety of different ways. We know this from Katrina and more. Talk a bit about that if you don't mind, Jake.
Yeah, so I was trying to kind of look at the effects of sea level rise and coastal erosion on, coastal communities that aren't like big developed cities like Miami. So I went to this area about an hour and a half south of New Orleans. This is a long, very, very long standing indigenous community, mostly made up of like inshore shrimp fishermen. And for a long time, it was extremely self-sufficient. Like they could raise cattle, they could grow their own crops, they could obviously get shrimp and get pelts from nutria to sell for fur. And then as the coast eroded, it just became impossible to sustain this kind of community, right? Like the ground was too wet for the cattle to walk on. It's too salty to grow the crops. And the independence of the community kind of fell apart. And the only available work, besides offshore shrimp fishermen, is working for the oil industry.
Mm.
And there's a kind of like deep resonance here that I thought was really important to highlight, where, there's both man-made climate change, which is like these global phenomena that are changing the way that weather works and water works, and that's happening there. But there's also this just sort of like straightforward human-caused environmental degradation that you can see right in front of your eyes. And so in the case of Louisiana, it was the oil industry that they basically sliced up the whole marshland so that they could build canals to get, benzene and oil in and out of the Gulf. And this was like there was a twofold problem where the oil industry, they destroyed the marsh, and then the global warming caused by the oil industry then further caused the seas to rise. So it's just sort of this nexus of a lot of the causes of climate change and just the way that we relate to land. And you had a community that had a deeply productive and sustainable relationship to this marshland environment that's basically been evicted over a century, by the actions of big oil.
Well, it really is, big oil creeping in. It's almost kind of shock doctrine on a micro scale where they're able to exploit the macro conditions created by climate change, which they contribute to, and then on the ground, they creep in on like indigenous self-sustaining communities for their own profit. That's a, a really good encapsulation of what we're dealing with, I would say. I also wanted to talk a bit about this North Carolina historically black city that was built on flood-prone land that you talk about in your book. Because
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the fact that that city was even built
Yeah.
also is one of the um, long-term kind of structural climate exposure issues for non-white, non-wealthy communities in the US.
Yeah, I mean the town Lincoln City was built on land that I mean essentially nobody else really wanted it, right? And this is true in a lot of other places in North Carolina, like where formerly enslaved populations they bought land that was too flood prone to use for even for agriculture, or that was how the white planters viewed it, right? And so this was a really like important one though because a lot of times when you talk about the solutions to this kind of climate vulnerability, what people say is like, well, we can, give people money to move elsewhere or relocate them. And that's like one of the best tools that we have to fix this problem, right? If you get people out of the way, then they can't be hit by the hurricane anymore, right? And so that makes sense in theory, but this was like the first time that the U.S. government really tried this was in 2000 after these two hurricanes hit this black community. And basically they came in and said, well, we'll give you guys money if you leave and move somewhere else in the city. And, there was really no other option as the government saw it. But for the people in the community, they saw this as a really, really deeply traumatic event, right? Where they
Mm.
wanted to stay, they wanted to rebuild, and they were really attached to this land. It was the only place that most of their families had ever been able to own property or had ever lived in the postbellum era. And the government really didn't give them much of a choice. They said, well, we'll give you the money and you leave, right? And so this is called managed retreat. It's like a climate adaptation policy. But here it was a really, really, really tragic event. And it destroyed this really thriving community, which was very vulnerable. And a lot of the people, once they left and took the money, they really didn't fare so well. Their homes went into foreclosure because they couldn't keep up with the more expensive mortgage, or they lost track of their, community that they had once had, right? So I think it's like a cautionary tale for how to solve the problem of like, yes, you can move people, but there's a really, really, really deep intangible thing that people have with their communities and with the places that they live. And we have to respect that and find a way to honor that, even as we try to help people move out of the worst affected areas.